If I see one more person say Brisbane are back, I'm going to lose it. They're not back. They didn't go anywhere. They just didn't kick straight for 2 weeks, and their pressure was maybe like 10% down. They haven't gone anywhere. They were third on the ladder coming into tonight. What they did do was solidify their credentials to any of the doubters. So let's talk about what they did to spoil Danger's 350th game. So the first player that I want to talk about is obviously going to be Logan Morris because he's kicked 5 goals, 2 weeks in a row. He's one of my absolute favourites. Pick 31 in the draft a couple of years ago and is blossoming in front of our eyes. He signed the contract, or the extension, I should say, and it looks like that's costing him potentially some coin from other clubs, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, guys. I love that he's staying at Brisbane. Unless players are coming to the Hawks, I want you to stay at your club, right? That's the way that I go. That can be the bias in me. But he was awesome, and they do that on Jack Henry, who in my opinion is he would be on the podium for underrated key defenders in this competition, was an absolutely huge tick. And what was so impressive from Brisbane, and of course I'll talk about more of their players in just a sec, is I don't think I've seen a team on GMHBA Stadium play the ball between the arcs as good as that. And look, I don't think I've seen Geelong play it worse, to be honest, but we're sticking with the winners here, obviously. They were fantastic. The ball movement was electric. They wanted to change angles all of the time. They, as much as possible, had an extra at the ball carrier and behind the ball. So they covered themselves at the contest and then behind the ball until it got to that third quarter for the majority of the first half, in which the score was like 46-23. The reason why Brisbane were on a lower score than they probably deserved to be coming out of the game was because they didn't let themselves try to get out the back all that much. They wanted to stay in the game, overwhelmed with numbers, and kick their way through. And it worked to a treat. Now, of course, the game opened up in that third quarter and they were able to punish the Cats and not let them back into the game. But what was super impressive about this was the fact that they were able to go, come with us if you can. And they sweated on the mistakes and they did everything that you expect a top 4 team to do, no matter who they played against. And they were fantastic. At this point in time, though, what it does do is it kind of makes me worried about the gap between Collingwood and everyone else in the competition at this point in time, because they look so far ahead of everyone else. Boy, but Brisbane, are they Geelong's bunnies? Beat them the last time they played at the MCG, beat them the last time they played at GMHBA Stadium. I'm not sure. But the difference between the way that Brisbane handled the Cats versus the Giants when they won there earlier this year is not only did they not let this become a shootout, and look, I know Geelong had, 22, 23 inside scoring shots, I should say, 6 goals, 15. So they had 21 scoring shots on the night. Well, to 22, there you go, in terms of Brisbane. And it wasn't as if they gave Geelong easy shots. Look, some of them were. I'm not going to deny that for a moment. Kicking 3 goals, 9 from set shots for the Cats, I would not recommend doing, by the way. But also, you got to recognise that if the Cats kick straighter and they make it 9 goals, 3, for example, they're only giving themselves 30-point gap there. 30 points added onto their score. Brisbane still win by 11 points. So it's not as if, if Geelong kick straighter, they'd win the game. That's actually not true. And they didn't deserve to win the game because, and I like the quote from Gary Lyon, and I believe this to be true as well, is you're only as good as the opportunities you give yourself, and you're only as good as the chances that the opposition give you. And Brisbane took advantage of both of those in a big way. And look, fantasy points aren't everything. I understand that. But if you look at the guys who were leading the pack, you've got Zorko, Dunkley, Berry, Ashcroft, McCluggage. 2 things there stand out. 1, all players that operate between the arcs, and a lot of them can do it defensively. So Zorko, I know, is not a defensive player, but plays off the half back line. Dunkley, who was able to put pressure on. What did Dunkley lay in terms of tackles? 10. Jared Berry can be a more defensive winger. Will Ashcroft, in terms of his handballing, he only had 11 kicks, but ended up with 28 disposals, one of those being a goal. First goal of the game, I actually think it was, for Wilbur. And then you got McCluggage, who's an offensive threat. It just worked beautifully. And the second thing that stood out, Lachie Neale's not included in that. Tom Atkins did a really good job. In fact, how many touches did Lachie Neale have? There we go. He had 17. Okay, I think I remember about 8 of them, to be honest. So 17 disposals, barely any impact, and the midfield was still on top. They had 7 of the first 8 clearances. They had 4 of the first 5 center clearances. They took to Geelong's midfield and exposed them. And they exposed them in a couple of ways. The first way that they exposed them was out the back of the stoppage. Now, Brisbane have killed a lot of teams out the front of the stoppage this year, but the way that they were able to go either Ashcroft or Dunkley to get a handball to go Geelong's way, but set up behind the stoppage well enough that they weren't caught out. Bailey and Rayner worked really well up front. Kai Lohmann did as well. I loved what Cam Rayner managed to do during this game. He kicked 3 goals too, playing as a pseudo hybrid second tall effectively. I know Sam Day played, but he had no scoreboard impact and kind of played as the target further up the ground. And I thought structurally did a really good job. Sam Day did what he had to do, but Rayner did a really good job there. And Geelong just couldn't match them. And sure, they had some hit-outs to advantage and some key centre clearances in that second half, but Bailey Smith couldn't hit a target effectively. So Brisbane were able to get on top in that way. And then the 2 youngsters down back, Darcy Wilmot fills out Nigel Lappin's number 44 so well, it's unbelievable. And then you've got Jasper Fletcher, who, of course, plays nothing like Michael Voss in the number 3, but I love him anyway. So calm, composed, and just looking at this beautifully. And then, of course, you've got Levi, who played one of his better games for the last sort of month or so. I don't really understand the rhetoric on Twitter that he's apparently sewn up the rising star. Murphy Reid, Harvey Langford, like these guys still exist, right? So not really sure that's the case, but this was probably the first proper game I've seen from Brisbane where no one had an outright bad day. Look, Eric Hipwood, who kicked the behind, he only had 6 touches, but he didn't really get beaten on the night, did Eric. He didn't play on Jezza the entire time. Sure, he didn't stand out, but he didn't really make any egregious errors anywhere. This was a well-rounded, brilliantly coached performance by the reigning premier, and at this point in time would be the first or second best team in the competition. A massive credit to them, and they deserve all the flowers. But now let's talk about the Cats. You know, they often say that to be the best, you got to beat the best, and Geelong obviously did not do that, but that midfield got monstered. Holmes, Smith, I know Smith had 28 disposals, but he went at 57% disposal efficiency. His kicking efficiency this year has been horrid, to be honest. Look, he's had a really good year, I'm not going to deny that. 20 points ahead of Holmes in the coaches voting before this. That'll probably stay the same because neither of those two, I don't suspect, are going to get any coaches votes. But Tom Atkins was amongst their best. Jack Martin, I thought Jack Martin played a pretty tidy game tonight. Again, wasn't outstanding, but out of all the Geelong players that kept making mistakes, he wasn't really one of them. Don't think I've seen Brian Myers or Jack Henry play worse games of footy than that. And look, there's going to be some solace in the fact that they were only 1 scoring shot behind. And look, if anyone's going to be able to come across and say, hey, if goal kicking is your biggest problem, you don't really have that many problems, it's going to be Brisbane for, you know, the aforementioned 8 behinds against the Crows and then 13-18 last week or whatever it was that they kicked. The big concern for mine with the Cats was the ball movement between the arcs. They haven't been that bad in a long time, and sometimes it wasn't under a whole lot of pressure. In fact, coming off 28 tackles last week, how many tackles did Brisbane have? If I can find this quickly, I apologise, this might be terrible for me to look at. Okay, Brisbane did lay 61, Geelong laid 60. Jesus Christ. But between the arcs, so tackles in forward 50. So if you take those out, so you're talking from Geelong's defensive 50-metre arc forward of the ball, they laid 49 tackles, Brisbane. It's not a lot. It's good numbers, by the way, but it's not, you know, out of this world amazing. So 49 tackles in the wet. I understand conditions didn't help, but both teams had to play in the same conditions, guys. Like, that's outrageous, to be fair. But it wasn't under a whole lot of pressure. It wasn't a game where I went, oh, Brisbane suffocated the life out of them. It wasn't like that in the slightest. And they fumbled, they bumbled. It was so bad. And look, I feel bad for Danger. And look, some of it self-inflicted. 3 behinds, 1 out on the full. I understand that. And when he was around the footy, things happened. Not denying that for a moment, but 350 games for the champion that he's been, even though as a Hawthorn fan, especially during my teenage years, early adult years, as he went from the Crows to Geelong, Hawthorn don't really like Geelong, obviously. And look, I take no pleasure from the analysis point of view in Geelong losing. I can compartmentalise and just go, what were they like as a football team? The Hawthorn fan inside of me is going, but that's not the way that I approach this analysis, right? It would be, I'm talking about them the exact same way if any other club had lost this way and played this game. And I don't really need to convince you otherwise of that. I think you can tell. at this point. But Danger's ended up having 15 touches. I think he went at like 40 odd percent, 47% disposal efficiency, which look sucks. That's what I'm saying. Had six score involvements. Of course, half of those were the scores that he kicked. Took 2 marks, but time on ground 80%, 250 meters game, which is fine. Only had 2 centre bounce attendances. Interesting. Look, 350 games, but considering how contested Brisbane's midfield want to play, that seems really low. 1 clearance, yuck. How many tackles did he have? 2. Neither of those were inside 50. Had 4 inside 50s. It was just a dirty day for Danger, unfortunately. And look, am I that worried about the Cats moving forward? I'm pretty happy to say that this is going to be, heading into the bye, a mulligan. They've got Richmond at GMHBA after the bye. I love you, Richmond. I love what you've been doing this year, but I think Geelong are going to kick the crap out of them, to be perfectly honest with you. And then they've got GWS, and I think that's the game where I'll look at and go, is this a trend or is it a problem? At this point in time, I will write it off. I'll be interested to see if other people are doing the same, and we'll go from there. But a massive credit to Brisbane, and that is my review, guys. I hope you enjoyed heading into a massive Saturday of footy. I hope you're well. You deserve it, you absolute champion. Thank you so much for watching. Like the video if you like the video. Subscribe to join the Daz Talks Footy family. I will see you for the Saturday session where I rate and review every single team that plays on Saturday. Have a good one. See you then.